They rose early in the morning and went out into the wilderness of Tekoa. And as they went out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, "Listen to me, O Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will be established. Believe his prophets, and you will succeed." When they had taken counsel with the people, he appointed those who were to sing to the Lord and praise him in holy splendor, as they went before the army, saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for his steadfast love endures forever." As they began to sing and praise, the Lord set an ambush against the Ammonites, Moab, and Mount Seir, who had come against Judah, so that they were routed. For the Ammonites and Moab attacked the inhabitants of Mount Seir, destroying them utterly. And when they had made an end of the inhabitants of Seir, they all helped to destroy one another. When Judah came to the watchtower of the wilderness, they looked towards the multitude. They were corpses lying on the ground. No one had escaped. When Jehoshaphat and his people came to take the spoil from them, they found livestock in great numbers, goods, clothing, and precious things, which they took for themselves, until they could carry no more. They spent 3 days taking the spoil because of its abundance. The book of Chronicles has some pretty wild stories, but that particular story from 2 Chronicles 20 has got to be the wildest. It is the story of how, in the days of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, he faced a combined invasion of 3 nations. But the amazing thing is not just that Jehoshaphat's kingdom survived this threat. They actually won. They defeated them all and took the plunder. But how did they win? By assembling an elite fighting force? By allying with an even more powerful nation? No. In fact, Jehoshaphat doesn't form an army at all. Instead, he forms a choir. It is the kind of story that might well inspire a fair bit of skepticism. I mean, I'm sure that there are some choristers and glee clubs out there that believe that their singing is world class, but none of them are going to go up against an army in the field. What's more, it is not all that hard to imagine some scribe composing this story as a kind of parable to illustrate how people should place their trust in God and not in arms and violence. On top of that, the story is only found in the Chronicles and not in the Book of Kings, which were almost certainly written closer to the historical timeline of the ancient kings of Judah. So, I totally get it if someone wants to argue that this story never actually happened. And that wouldn't even bother me, because I'm not the kind of Christian who needs to have the Bible be always literally true in order for it to be true. But if you know me, you know that I love to speculate about how a story, no matter how fantastic, might just play out in the real world. Sometimes just by telling, or perhaps retelling the story, we might just see how it could have happened. So, why not? This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.7, Jumping Jehoshaphat. The Ammonites, the Moabites, and the people of Mount Seir were not exactly friendly neighbors. They lived in a stretch of land to the east of the Jordan River, one on top of the other. The Ammonites to the north, the Moabites in the middle, and the Edomites of Mount Seir further to the south. Over the years, they had often battled amongst themselves for various reasons, or sometimes for no reason at all. They had little love for one another, and even less trust. But they knew an opportunity when they saw one. And in the days when Jehoshaphat was king of Judah, they saw an opportunity. Jehoshaphat was a weak king, ruling over a kingdom that was struggling. It was dominated by its much more powerful neighbor, Israel, to the north. Judah's wealth and riches seemed to be ripe for the taking. And so, the three uneasy allies decided to join together. If they all cooperated, they would be able to raise an army 3, maybe 4 times larger than the number of fighting men in all Judea. It would be a cakewalk. And so it was that word came to King Jehoshaphat in Jerusalem that a great host from 3 nations had gathered together and was advancing from the east. Indeed, they were already past the Dead Sea and were at the springs of En-gedi in Judahite territory. This was an absolute and unmitigated disaster. The king knew that there was no way that he could possibly gather an army large enough to counter such a threat. He sat there, frozen with terror. This was it. There was no way they could possibly meet this crisis. It was the end of the kingdom of Judah. They were ruined. In desperation, he turned to the only resort of the hopeless. He turned to Yahweh, the God of Israel. He declared a fast and ordered an assembly of all the people from all the towns and villages of Judah. The people came together, and Jehoshaphat prayed before the assembly. He reminded Yahweh that if the kingdom of Judah were destroyed, it would reflect rather badly on its patron God. Most of all, he reminded God of a promise that if the people prayed towards the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, the God would answer them. And so the people prayed and prayed, for there was nothing else that they could do. And then, finally, there was an answer. A man named Jehaziel, son of Zechariah, fell into an altered state and began to prophesy. "Thus says Yahweh to you, do not fear or be dismayed at this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, but God's. Tomorrow go down against them. They will come up by the ascent of Ziz. You will find them at the end of the valley, before the wilderness of Jeruel. This battle is not for you to fight. Take your position, stand still, and see the victory of Yahweh on your behalf, O Judah and Jerusalem. Do not fear or be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, and Yahweh will be with you." Jehaziel shook and shuddered so as he spoke that no one doubted for a moment that this was truly a word from Yahweh. It seemed impossible, of course. There was no way that such a force could be defeated, and especially not just by standing still. Yet the words of the prophet immediately changed the mood of the assembly, from fear to at least the possibility of hope. The king was a natural leader of men, and as much as he appreciated the hopeful message of Jehaziel, he understood that standing still, as such, was not really an option. If the people are not given a task to pursue, or, at the very least, a direction to move in, it will always be impossible to hold them together. And he knew that if they did not have solidarity, they would unquestionably break and run at the first sign of trouble. Maybe he wasn't supposed to form them into armed ranks, but he would have to form them into something and give them something to do. But what? Suddenly, he had an idea. He motioned to the man who, over the last few years, had begun to train a cadre of singers in the temple at Jerusalem. When the man finally came to his side, Jehoshaphat told him the plan. "We're going to form a choir." Things were not going well in the combined camp of the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the people of Mount Seir. Ever since they had begun to pass through Judahite territory, the familiar fighting and bickering had started up amongst them. The Ammonites were fighting with the Moabites, saying that they could hardly fight at all, and the Ammonites would have to do all the heavy lifting. They said that the Moabites surely only deserved a small portion of the booty, that everyone was already dividing up in their minds. When the army made camp on the second day, it was the turn of the Edomites from Mount Seir to cook for everyone, and they naturally made their national dish, a red stew consisting mostly of lentils. They, for some strange reason, loved the stuff. But pretty much everyone else hated it, and then blamed the Edomites when they were all overcome with flatulence later in the night. It was not a pretty sight, and it didn't really make the camp smell very nice either. All right, everyone. Listen up. This is not going to work if we cannot keep in time. And remember to pronounce each word. And 1, and 2, and 1, 2, 3, 4. The director simply couldn't believe how far the Judahites were from being ready for this. The tenors couldn't have carried a tune if you packed it in a basket for them. He was pretty sure that the basses couldn't count past 4, and they always came in at the wrong place. And don't even get him started about the baritones. This was his big break. His first chance to put on a big cantata before the king, and it was going to be a disaster. Come on, people, keep it together. And don't forget the lyrics. It's "Give thanks to Yahweh, for his steadfast love endures forever." Choir practice was rudely interrupted at this point by the sudden arrival of the scouts. They reported that the very fragrant camp of the interlopers had been found just a few valleys to the west. It was time to move out. The choir director protested, of course, but it really was too late for excuses. The people formed up and, with the 1 and a 2 and a 1, 2, 3, they were off. As the Allied invaders broke camp that morning, things were not going well. The Moabites had been up all night, drinking beer and singing around their campfires until the wee hours of the morning. Many of them were now hungover, while the Ammonites were grumpy and complaining because they hadn't slept because of the noise. As for the men of Mount Seir, they had their own reason for being upset. Apparently, it was their habit to chew on the bitter beans that grew in the deep south of their land. It always gave them a jolt of energy to start their day. But they had apparently run out of their supply the day before, and so they were struggling with their own kind of withdrawal that none of the others could understand. So none of the 3 armies was in a good mood. And when a great and terrible noise began to approach from the west, none of them were in the mood to discuss what it was with any sort of rationality. They could not account for the strange cacophony that was echoing over the hills, but there was no doubt that it was an approaching host. The Ammonites were outraged. They accused the Moabites of tricking them. "You said that the Judahites were ripe for the plucking," they cried. "You promised that they couldn't even field an army, and yet they clearly seem to have fielded something. And they even seem to have some sort of sonic weapon that we've never heard of before. You have led us into a trap. And well, things escalated quickly from there. The Moabites pushed back at the Ammonites, calling them chickens. The men from Mount Seir began to accuse the Ammonites of actually being in league with the Judahites. Soon everyone was shouting so loud that it was drowning out even the sound of the approaching choir. And then it happened. Somebody notched an arrow or drew a sword. It didn't really matter who it was or which army they belonged to. All that mattered was that as soon as it happened in one place, it began happening all through the camp. Soon, blood was flowing, and men were falling, which quickly led everyone who was able to do so to drop everything and just get the hell out of there. The invasion was over. As the choristers came within sight of the abandoned camp, the director was just finally beginning to feel as if they were getting it. He was, frankly, exhausted. And who could blame him? He had basically been walking backwards the whole way, out in front, and constantly waving and gesticulating, trying to bring in the various sections on time. But as they crested the final hill, the chord that they struck almost sounded in tune. And then, suddenly, every voice fell silent, right in the middle of the stanza. The choir just stood there, jaws slack, and stared in disbelief at the scene. The director was furious, of course. He threw down his baton and started into his usual diatribe about watching for cues, but no one paid him any attention. When he realized that, he finally lost steam and turned around to look as well. The camp was empty, apart from the dead and the severely wounded, who were scattered about the plain. Everyone else had fled, and they had fled so quickly that the campfires still smoldered. In their haste, they had left most everything behind, including livestock, food, clothing, and even gold, silver, and precious jewelry. Eventually, Jehoshaphat stepped out from behind the ranks of choristers. He clearly could not quite believe what he was seeing any more than anyone else. But his political instincts told him that this was a moment he had to seize at all cost. God has given us the victory today, he cried. And now God has given us all of this booty that these armies have left behind. Thanks be to Yahweh. Now let's start plundering. And with that, Jehoshaphat made a great leap and, for some strange reason, spread out his arms and legs while he did so to form the shape of an X. And the people surged forward with a great shout. When I started this episode, I did acknowledge how implausible the whole story seemed. But as I look at it now, I can't say that I'm quite so sure. It is, at its heart, the story of 3 armies allying together to take on a much weaker opponent for what they thought would be easy pickings. And it is a story of how that weaker target didn't respond as expected. Whether they responded by forming a militia or by forming a choir matters less than the fact that they didn't simply melt away with fear. And when the Allied bullies met with resistance, when it turned out that they might actually have to risk their lives and fight, is it really all that unthinkable that their fragile alliance might have broken down? Or that they might have started fighting amongst themselves instead? That doesn't seem so unlikely to me anymore. So, while I cannot prove to you that this particular battle ever took place, there are truths to be found in this tale. Truths about the nature of bullies and their alliances of convenience, and truths about what it might mean to stand up to them, perhaps even with nonviolent resistance, even if that resistance doesn't always have to come in the form of 4-part harmony. Who knows? Maybe there's even a life lesson in this tale. That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Thanks for listening, and please subscribe so you can get the next and all future episodes. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was Birth of a Hero by Benjamin Tissot. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at bensound.com, respectively. You can contact me on Bluesky at Retelling the Bible. The Facebook page is Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks, as always, to my Patreon supporters. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to support this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.